This is the Person of Interest podcast, where we meet extraordinary people with a story to tell.
Welcome back to the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga for the latest in our series of podcasts in which we talk to people who know something about a particular field of expertise. Dare we call them experts in the modern world? I think my guest today definitely qualifies as an expert. His name is Jeremy Gilbert, and he has one of the more interesting job titles that I've come across in the media recently. He is Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Washington Post. Everyone's heard of the Washington Post. Director of Strategic Initiatives maybe sounds like something which belongs in the Pentagon War Room, but we'll get a definition of what that is presently. Speaking of the Washington Post, my kind of initial picture, which I think shows my age, is of someone reclining in a comfy chair with a broadsheet newspaper, lovely white, black print on lovely white pages, reclining backwards, opening it up. And the more I think about this, the more this must be the absolute antithesis of what the Washington Post is about these days. So, Jeremy, could you let us know what it is you do there, and what should I be thinking of now when I think of the Washington Post?
I think, honestly, we are absolutely comfortable for you to think of the Washington Post however you want, as long as you're thinking of great journalism that holds powerful people accountable. That's really at the heart of what the Post has been doing for the last 145 years, and it's especially true when you think about the role that the Washington Post has played in not just, but primarily American government, in thinking about holding the Nixon administration accountable, holding the Obama administration accountable, holding the current administration accountable. That's really at the heart of what the Post does. And I think the idea that you think about print is not inherently wrong, because it is true. Print is a really critical vehicle for us, at least in the Washington, D.C. geographic area. So we still distribute hundreds of thousands of newspapers every day. In truth, that's dwarfed by the reach that we have digitally. So digitally, we reach 10 to 15 million people a day across a variety of platforms. But for the people who get the printed paper, it's every bit as powerful and relevant. It's a curated experience in absolutely all the ways that we want. What we really encourage the people in our newsroom to think about is not that they produce their journalism for a specific platform or platforms, but that they think about producing stories. They gather the elements they need for those stories, and then they think about which elements tell the story the best way on the most appropriate platform for a specific type of audience. And so for some people, that's a newspaper. For other people, that's our TikTok channel. And for lots of people, it's our website or the apps where the majority of our digital audience lives.
And so before we get into the nuts and bolts of what a Director of Strategic Initiatives does, could you just outline your path to the Washington Post? I mean, was your intention always to get into the media, to get into journalism, or did you approach it from a different angle? I noticed in your biography that you were art director on a couple of newspapers. So is it more from the artistic side?
I've had a very varied path towards what I do now at the Post. I started out as a child delivering afternoon newspapers in Western Pennsylvania. I spent a lot of time working in print journalism, doing some reporting and some design work. But I really think the most important part about the art direction work that I did is to think collaboratively and cooperatively within the newsroom. That you cannot art direct journalistic coverage without dealing with editors, photographers, reporters, and everyone in between. And that idea that you can work across an organization and produce work that is the sum of all of that collaboration is really critical for what I do today. A large part also of what I do today is rooted in some of the experiences that I had in more academic environments. Teaching and at the Poynter Institute led me to really value research experimentation as part of the design process. So testing new models, new technologies, developing solutions for audience needs are really a key part of what I do today.
I think it's very important when you mentioned that you have this experience kind of in the newsroom with journalists as well as with designers and so on, because it does seem to me that in the modern media sphere that is something which is often missing, and that there is a tendency for sort of fragmentation, the different departments never really speaking to each other, maybe in a way that in the past they had to, because it's the only way you can put a newspaper together.
I think that's absolutely true. One of the things that I love about my current role at the Washington Post is that I report up through our executive editor, through Marty Barron. And even though I do that and I feel very rooted in the storytelling and in the newsroom, most of my work is with the technology team on the revenue side, with content planning that reaches across the organization. But I love the fact that the position, the perch from which I do that work is very, very much rooted in the storytelling and the accountability journalism that the Post does. I think that's really critical for the kind of planning that we want to do, is to say we are at the heart a story company that produces great technology, that has efficient distribution, that thinks about audience needs. But we do all of those things because we're rooted in the storytelling on a daily basis, breaking news, producing investigative reports. And that has to be at the heart of the technology, at the heart of the value that we offer either to direct audience members or towards the people who use some of our tools.
That's very interesting, because there can be a tendency maybe within media to think that the new technology basically is just spreading out what little news there is a lot wider, and that journalists get lazy, they don't go out, they don't make the calls, they don't use up the shoe leather. But it seems that with the Washington Post, what you're doing really does still depend upon journalists doing real journalism, and particularly investigative journalism.
Absolutely. So the Washington Post as a company, our business model is really, really focused on reader revenue, on subscribers and the role that subscribers play. It doesn't mean that advertising and other revenue paths don't matter, but that producing journalism of such quality and such value, such utility to our audience that they would pay directly is at the heart of everything that we do right now. And because of that, it does mean that we need to invest in that journalism. We need to make sure that the journalism we do is of the highest caliber, but also meets the needs and expectations of the audience members. And I agree, we have to avoid commodity news. It doesn't mean we don't cover stories of the day, but we need to find ways that we can layer on a special kind of understanding or add something to the discussion instead of just repeating the same types of information that other people have. That when we look at which articles drive subscriptions and which articles drive the deepest engagement with our audience, it's usually articles that we are bringing unique information that nobody else has yet, or a depth of information that no one else matches yet. When we produce the same type of stories that other competitors do, we don't see the same kind of audience engagement. So in a way, our business model rewards the kind of journalism we already want to do. It's the highest quality, but also the most unique.
I wonder, could you go into a little bit more detail about what the business model is now, and particularly the revenue streams? Because I'm assuming that they're sort of in a state of constant flux, and that to an extent you have to produce something which is consistent, but with different revenue streams coming in to sort of finance that. Is it difficult to keep a profitability or not make a huge financial error in some of these things which you're involved with, which are quite tech heavy and must involve a lot of sort of infrastructure investment, for example?
It's really interesting when you look at how the Post has evolved in a relatively short period of time. So the Graham family sells the Post after more than 80 years of ownership to Jeff Bezos in the late fall of 2013. At that time, the Post revenue was almost all tied to print advertising, print subscriptions, very sort of locally focused in terms of the revenue. 2 years later, the Post had managed to more than double the size of its digital audience, and digital advertising became increasingly important. About a year and a half after that, we started talking primarily about subscription-oriented revenue. So as a company, we changed pretty quickly. There are other sources of revenue for sure. We're doing much more with live events today. We're licensing a lot of technology, both on the advertising side and the publishing suite of tools that we call ARC. But still, that major transition from advertising to subscription revenue, and advertising still plays a really key role, but the focus of the company being how do we grow our subscription revenue is a dramatic change that took place over the last couple of years. In terms of the technology investment we make, it's absolutely true that we look at not just the revenue streams as they stand now, but the revenue streams as we predict them to be. So we have hundreds of engineers who are working on ARC, the publishing tools, and that's because we believe in the next 3 years that business could be worth almost $100 million in US dollars in revenue. And so we're looking not just at what the revenue looks like now, but also how do we focus on the revenue model that we anticipate in the near term. It's pretty hard to look beyond 3 or 4 years out because 3 or 4 years ago, we would have told you we were an advertising company that sold print subscriptions. And today we would tell you we're a digital subscription company that also sells advertising. So those things are going to change relatively quickly. But in the near term, we can look ahead and we can say it is worth investing in technology because of the way that technology helps us tell better stories and the way that technology improves our publishing tools, which let us sell and license to other publishers and people interested in advertising.
I do recall that when the Washington Post made this decision to sort of stay with subscriptions and a belief in subscriptions, a lot of people said this was commercial suicide and that, you know, within a couple of years that it would have folded. Do you think that maybe it's become almost like an old-fashioned word-of-mouth thing, where when you see that someone has taken out a subscription, you feel, well, he's the sort of person that I kind of trust, or maybe I should do it too, and that in a sense it's re-established a link between your readers and the newsroom with the actual journalists, in that they feel that they're directly sort of subsidizing the news?
I think the journalists really love a subscription-focused business because they feel like the better the journalism they produce, the more likely people are to directly contribute. And I also think that there are some aspirational aspects that you see someone that you want to model yourself after who's a subscriber. That's a wonderful business. I think there are a couple of other factors that have really changed. One, people have gotten used to buying things on the internet in a way that even 5 or 6 years ago was not quite so common. Two, that there are a lot of other content-oriented businesses, music, video, streaming services like Hulu and Netflix, that have really made subscribing for content seem like a reasonable proposition. And then three, I think there are some generational differences in who is a subscriber. As more and more millennials and Gen Xers are coming of age and have the purchasing power to make decisions about the content that they want to subscribe to, that subscribing to news content in a digital environment with internet-only payment feels much more natural. And so the confluence of all of those factors made us transition towards a subscription business at a really fortuitous time.
I wonder if we might take a couple of concrete examples of things that you've been doing with the newspaper. First of all, I was reading something about covering the 2016 presidential race with 3D printers. And now I sat down and I thought about this and I tried to work out what this might mean. I know what 3D printers are, I know what the 2016 presidential race was, but I couldn't come up with an interface between the two. So can you please enlighten me?
One of the challenges we focus on, especially every 4 years, but is how can we tell a story that everyone else is telling in a way so unique and so different that people will tune in just to see how we tell it. Because the information about how many votes are cast and for who is essentially a commodity within American journalism. And so on the night that people have many, many choices about who can tell them who's ahead and who's behind in a presidential race, we wanted to do something very different. And so what we decided to do is we paired two 3D printers side by side, and we had two models of the White House, one printed in blue and one in red. And as each electoral vote came in, the 3D printer printed just that much of the model. And so we live streamed this on Facebook Live at the time, and we had about 1.2 million people tune in sometime over the course of the printing, which lasted about 7 hours, to see how far along we were. And we had a person who was coloring in a map side by side on the live stream, so we had some alternates. But I will say, not only is it a project that I loved, but we gave to Jeff Bezos the models, and he claims that they're in his office. Not that I've been invited to see them, but it's kind of a fun thing to think about that he has the Hillary Clinton model of the White House partially finished and the Donald Trump completed.
I mean, that's a great story. Now I understand. I mean, it must have been such a good concept that having formerly known nothing about it, not been able to guess it, as soon as you say it, it seems to make sense. I mean, but what is the decision-making process to approve something like that? Because it may be in the traditional model, you all sit around a table, someone says, look, I've got this wacky idea, and someone shouts it down and says, you know, that's silly. They don't realize that this holy grail of going viral or whatever it is sometimes relies upon doing something which you could fail quite badly. I mean, presumably you could have looked pretty silly and it would look tokenistic and gimmicky. It didn't. So, I mean, what is the decision-making process? Because it seems that with your job title, maybe you're sort of floating between the different departments as a sort of interlocutor.
I have a lot of latitude within the organization because a lot of my job spans different parts of the company. But I think we wanted to measure the success of that project in particular in two different ways. One, it actually directly drove revenue. One of the election sponsors was incredibly excited about being associated with a different way to tell the stories like this. And so there was a direct sponsorship that not only paid for our costs, but was dramatically profitable. So that was one way we wanted to measure it. And the second thing we wanted to do was measure audience engagement. So we did really feel like, looking at some past experiments we had done, that there was an opportunity to do something so different that people would tune in a way that they might not for a traditional map, or at least that there were so many people who offered the same traditional map that it was going to be hard for us to stand out. And so in cases like this, we try to say, how best can we forecast what we expect or hope to get out of this? We partnered with Facebook to help us with the distribution, partnered with MakerBot to help figure out how to make the model and synchronize it to the results. And so we were able, through these partnerships, to get a sense of what we thought the potential audience for the project would be. And so we did all of that before we ever committed to doing it. But I agree, it took a little bit of selling. At first, when you just say, I want to 3D print the results of the election, no one in the newsroom was particularly excited. But once I showed some models and once I showed some forecasts, what did we expect the metrics to look like, it was a lot easier to sell it.
Well, something that maybe would get people in the newsroom excited or maybe afraid is the idea of automated stories. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Is this some sort of dystopian future that we journalists are all going to be on the scrap heap within 5 years?
It's certainly not the way that I see it, and the reaction from the Post newsroom has been pretty positive. I would say, in general, the challenge we have with the Post newsroom as it relates to the machine-generated content that we're producing, the automated stories that we create, is that there are more people who see rote and mundane aspects of their job that they would like to automate so they can do something else than we have developers available to do it. And so the goal always was, how can we help scale up our election efforts? That's where we started with machine-generated content. So historically, the Post had sent human reporters out to cover maybe 4 or 5% of all of the federal races, the U.S. House, the U.S. Senate, the president. And those races were all the competitive races, the races that most people would just, on the face of it, track. And in 2012, as the Post was reaching maybe 25 or 30 million unique visitors in the US, we tried to expand a little bit, and they covered maybe 20% of the races by having human editors and reporters in the newsroom write directly off the results. So it was very template driven, but it was done completely by hand. And so together, maybe they got to a quarter of all the races. Well, by 2016, we were talking about reaching, in November of 2016, the Post reached 100 million unique visitors in the States. And we knew we needed to cover even more people than we had, more races than we had been able to cover in 2012. And so automation was a really good way to do that, because we weren't going to send human reporters for most of, for example, the House races, where the incumbent often wins by a wide margin, but we felt like we owed our audience, which was distributed across the United States, to tell them an important story, which is the story of their elected representatives. And so wanting to tell every story, automation was the way to scale that. And so we were able to build templates that were designed and developed by reporters and editors in the Post Politics team that said, under these circumstances, tell the story this way. It's a sort of branching logic that looked at the results. And what's even more powerful for us is that we were able to take the results in real time. And so we wrote and rewrote the stories every 60 to 90 seconds as the election results came in a way that we never would have been able to do with human journalists. And we were able to geolocate the visitors to the site and say, in addition to all the news that our human editors and reporters think is important, we also suspect that you are in this area and therefore you might care about results from this place. Mm-hmm. And so we'll supply those with Heliograph, our automated storytelling system, but that we could pair the most important coverage that we did with our humans with coverage that might be important to you because of where you are geographically. And so together, we supply what we think is most important. And so we've really tried to use all of our automation as complementary to our human journalists. And we've tried to emphasize that what we want to do, if the stories you're doing are fairly repetitive and they're driven by data, then we should use automation for those and try to free you up so you can write stories that only you can write, do deeper profiles, do analysis, uncover new facts, do things that are not so easy to automate.
That's fascinating. It kind of answers what I intended to ask next, which was if the technology is actually changing the content of the stories, or they were being written in a different way. I mean, it suggests that with these instant rewrites or incredibly fast rewrites, but maybe that is the case, that you have to think about stories in ways which are compatible with the technology rather than trying to, come up with your journalistic triangle story and then just force it into the format.
I'd almost look at it a different way. So we've also used heliograph to help cover the Olympics, a couple of Olympics now, 2016, 2018, and we'll use it again in 2020. And in those cases, what we found is it really freed up the human journalists from having to write deadline sports coverage that is all about who won. Because if the machine can tell people who won, and the human can tell people why that person won or what motivated them to be in the event in the first place, that's so much more powerful, so much richer, and so differentiated from the kinds of coverage that other people can do because they're too busy watching the outcome of the event, that it becomes a real differentiator because it frees up the humans to do things differently. So yes, it changes the way that potentially they approach stories, but in a way that I think is much more freeing than it is an imposition.
Yeah, I certainly like the idea that journalists will be freed up to write the more colourful pieces and let the machines crank out the standard issue updates. We're just about run out of time, but there was one other thing I wanted to ask you. The Washington Post has a tremendous track record. It's won, I think, nearly 50 Pulitzer Prizes over the years. It's been around, as you say, for 145 years, and some of the biggest names in American journalism have worked there. But with the way that technology is changing so rapidly now, are we going to see another Mencken, Gellhorn, Bob Woodward, or is it impossible for a single journalist to kind of straddle the various different technologies, and we're just going to see real specialists, maybe even only active for a short period of time, rather than a sort of towering figure whom everyone refers to and believes that they sort of almost embody the news?
I think one thing that I really love in looking at the recent success the Post has had with Pulitzer Prizes is how much it's a team-based reporting approach today. So it is certainly true that in an age where our best journalism demands so many different types of skills, data analysis, audience engagement, as well as reporting and editing, design, graphics, video, audio, that certainly you see more than ever a sense that the best journalism is done by many people instead of one. On the other hand, the relationship that social media allows some of our journalists, many of our best reporters, to have directly with their audience is really powerful. David Farenthold, who won a Pulitzer Prize a couple of years ago for some investigative work he did about the Trump Foundation, had an incredible relationship with his audience directly, especially on Twitter. And in many cases, some of his best stories came from work that his Twitter audience did on his behalf, helping to track down story leads, helping to determine the provenance of particular documents or the location of a particular painting. And in many ways, I think the audience has a closer, more familiar relationship with David Farenthold than they ever were able to have with Bob Woodward, because the only way that they saw Bob Woodward's stories were in print. And so they didn't have a direct interaction. And now, with social media, with the use of audio, with the use of video, in many ways, our journalists today feel much, much closer to their audience than they ever could have before.
Well, that's a suitably optimistic point on which to end it, I think. So thank you very much for joining me today, Jeremy, and enjoy the rest of your time in Riga.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. This podcast was produced by SSC Riga. If you'd like to learn more about the topic, visit the open course schedule at SSC Riga Executive Education. For more podcasts, find us on Spotify, iTunes, or the platform of your choice. Remember, share this episode with your friends and colleagues.